Hi, so my name is Vanessa Bowden. I'm a sociologist at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And I've been doing some work with Professors Daniel Nyberg, who's also at the University of Newcastle, and Professor Chris Wright, who's at the University of Sydney in Australia, on climate adaptation. So we've been looking at regions that are already starting to face the impacts of climate change and how they're managing to do that, both from a business perspective, a governance perspective, and a community perspective. So what I'm presenting today is actually a smaller case study of a project that we call Climate Hotspots, looking at these vulnerable areas and how they're managing it. So this study was based in Lake Macquarie. It's a local government area, so a small government area just south of Newcastle where the university is. And that's actually important because the University of Newcastle has what is known as the world's biggest coal port. So we have a very strong coal and mining industry in the broader region, and Lake Macquarie is the local government area that sits just south of us. So I'm not sure how well people can see on this presentation, but Lake Macquarie is on the east coast of Australia, just to give you some idea. And the reason that we chose Lake Macquarie is because it's particularly vulnerable. The region, there's housing built all around the lake, which is one of the largest saltwater lakes in the Southern Hemisphere. So there's housing around the lake, but then also on the other side, if you can see in the diagram, sits the ocean. So they're facing a number of issues related to climate change, to do with sea level rise. There's potentially problems with erosion on the beach side as well. The region actually already floods at times when they have heavy rainfall. So that's why we chose this particular case study to look at how they're adapting to climate change. Just to give you a very brief timeline of the sort of process and context of our research. Around 2007, 2008, there was a lot of awareness. I mean, I think we saw that internationally with the fourth assessment report about the potential impacts of climate change and the causes of it. And Lake Macquarie Council took this information up quite early, given that the region is vulnerable, and released an adaptation policy in 2008. Around 2009, our federal government also released a report actually saying that Lake Macquarie, partly because of how much of it is built around the lake, is one of the 6 most vulnerable regions in Australia to climate change. So the council sort of took this information, had a whole bunch of modelling done, and actually worked out exactly where the properties that were most vulnerable to sea level rise and rises in the lake as well, which areas were most vulnerable. So they went through a couple of years looking at this background and modelling what they needed to do. They, in 2011, contacted the landowners who had buildings in the regions that were considered most vulnerable, and that was about 7,000 property owners. So when they did this, they actually engaged in quite intensive consultation with the community and brought them along and said, this is the problem, we want to work with you to fix it. And it was very, very controversial. At the time, there was a lot of concern about people's property values decreasing as a result of being labelled as vulnerable. So in 2016, they finally brought out a report for one section of that region with a plan of what they were going to do. And really the ultimate plan was to act when it was necessary, that they were going to keep a watching eye on certain indicators and that they would have to change things as they came up. So what publicly, the story was a very big success. There was a lot of pushback from the community, a lot of concerns, and the community came out with the council and stood by this report in 2016. So we identified this as a really interesting case study of climate adaptation, and we actually went into the community in 2019, so sometime after that, after everyone had been through this process. We interviewed people from business groups, from the local government, a handful of experts, and then also people from the community, because what we wanted to understand was how people perceived this process to work and what their opinions about climate change were. So when we went into the community, we were a little bit surprised to find that there was still a lot of contention about climate change in particular. And so we had things like some members of the community would talk about climate change and say, yes, it's real, but we're not sure whether it's caused by humans, and we need to do this planning anyway. And what we actually discovered when we talked to a lot of people within the consultation process was that they said, well, actually, we deliberately stopped talking about climate change because it became too contentious. Another thing that continually came up was this idea that people in the community had, and some of the politicians actually, of, you know, we'll be able to deal with it. The human spirit will overcome things. So there was conversations about, in Australia, we regularly have quite dramatic bushfires. They do a lot of damage. And there were conversations about, well, you know, we'll just defend our homes. We'll defend our homes against sea level rise in the same way that we defend them against fires. But actually, a lot of people lose their houses in fires. So there was a real romanticism about the built environment and our ability to withstand dramatic impacts of climate change. The council in this regard had a particular challenge as well, because the local newspaper were not very supportive of their plans. So they actually we spoke to people in the media at the time who said straight up, yeah, look, it just made for great images in the paper. So we put it on the front page because, you know, it was dramatic and it was appealing to our audience. And that actually didn't particularly help in terms of the fear in the community about losing their properties. We also had, and that's sort of partly why it's good to know that Newcastle is very close to there. There were people who, one person was the Lord Mayor in Newcastle at the time, who is also a property developer and has property in Lake Macquarie, and was very, very vocal about this being a particular problem that, you know, they didn't want people to talk about climate change because it was going to damage property values. So in many ways, it became a bit of a classic sort of competition between people's immediate property values and talking about climate change and the future. So to sum it up, our conclusions were really that while a lot of people didn't say straight up that they denied climate change, a few did, what actually happened in the process of deliberation was a coming together to say, okay, well, we're not going to talk about climate change because that was too contentious. And so while the council was very successful in bringing the community around, the outcomes of the plan and the report were, we're just going to wait and see in many ways. So that was quite a problem. And we have argued in a number of papers that I'll list at the end here that actually what this amounts to is a transformation in the denial of climate change. So while people might be starting to agree that it's happening, the disagreements about how to deal with it and how to manage it are really still quite deeply embedded. And actually that means that in reality, we don't actually do anything to respond to climate change. And in many ways, we're still kind of waiting. So I have a whole heap of writing on this issue. I'd love for, if people are interested, to go and have a look at it, and please ask me any questions or get in touch.